Okay, here we go. Hey guys, welcome to another Monday morning chat with Rozella, Steffani over in Spokane, Washington. Hi ladies, how are you?
Hello. Hello. We're good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you so much.
Good.
Good. We were chatting about seller contributions prior to our call and thought we would continue that on our call. So let's do that, shall we?
Okay, Michelle.
Okay. So seller contributions, you want to start with the questions you had, or shall I define them, or where shall we go?
Define them. That way people know what we're talking about. That way they're understanding when we're explaining what our part is, or unless you have a whole nother idea. Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. A seller contribution from the lender's perspective, and that's what counts, of course, is the seller giving a credit to the buyer towards their closing costs. There are certain parameters around that. It depends on the type of loan you're doing, how much they can credit. It depends on the down payment amount that you have, how much they can credit, and things of that nature. But generally speaking, the seller credit can range between 3% and 6% of the sales price. So it's pretty significant. It cannot go toward the down payment. You need to understand that. It can only go toward closing costs and reserves and taxes and insurance and stuff like that for the buyer. And there are great reasons to use it. It reduces the cash to close for the buyer. That's very significant. The seller is going to get a big chunk of money, like $500,000 or $1 million or whatever it is. So they can just take a portion of that, move it over to the buyer's side of the closing statement, help reduce the closing costs. That reduces what's called the cash to close from the buyer coming to closing. And you can effectively get them with just basically their down payment. And if it's like a zero down payment kind of loan, VA in particular, USDA, they can get into a house with almost nothing because the closing costs are taken care of by the seller.
Are we
So there
allowed
you
to
go.
know that sometimes on those zero down loan programs like the VA, where I have seen that when they get a contribution, sometimes the seller, or excuse me, the buyer ends up getting a credit back at closing?
We're not going to let the buyer get a credit back at closing.
Oh.
We're going to use everything we can toward the buyer's closing costs, and if there's any excess, it stays with the seller.
Okay, good to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a client who's looking to purchase a house, we'll say $450,000. They're going to get 3% credited to them from the seller. And although it can't be used for their down payment, which part of their down payment was taking into consideration how much they wanted to potentially buy down their interest rate.
Okay.
Can you explain how that works a little bit for us?
Yeah, so understand that there are two different ways we look at interest rate buy downs. There's the permanent buy down of the interest rate. So let's start at the top. When you get a loan and we look at your credit score and see the kind of loan, and you're going to get a particular interest rate, whatever it is. And that's you can pay anywhere from 0 points to 1 or 2 points. 1 point is 1% of your loan amount. So if you pay 1 point on that $400,000 loan, whatever it is, that's $4,000. And you get a lower rate for the term of the mortgage. So that's a permanent buy down. If you pay 2 points, you're going to get even a lower rate, and so on. And some people will take and get as much as 2% toward the closing costs. And just a little tidbit, guys, if you were negotiating, and Steffani and Rozella are really good at this, instead of, as from the buyer's perspective, instead of getting a reduction in the purchase price, if you get the same amount toward a seller contribution toward your closing costs and use that to buy down the rate, you'll almost always end up with a lower payment and pay lower interest compared to getting the same amount in a reduction in the purchase price. So the rate buy down works really well, in other words, when you compare it. And we'll show you that. We always do that. We strategize with our buyers and say, well, if you do this, you get this. And if you do that, you get that. And it usually comes out very clear once they see the numbers that go, oh, I want that one. So that's the permanent rate buy down. You can also do what's called the temporary rate buy down, in which the seller pays for that. Most of them, not all, but let's just say most of them are paid by the seller, and they're required that the seller pay for that temporary buy down. And you buy the rate down for a particular period of time, like 1 year or 2 years or even 3 years. It's called a 3-2-1 buy down when you do it that. So the rate is 3% lower than the permanent rate on the 3-2-1 buy down. And then the second year goes up to 2% lower. And the third year goes up to 1% lower. And finally, on the fourth year, it goes up to the permanent rate for the loan for the rest of the mortgage. Does that make sense?
Yes. Total sense. Very cool. With that one, is the end rate, once you get to that 1 year mark or the 0 mark, I guess, if you will, 4-year mark, depends on which one they do. But what rate at that point is then going to be their set rate? Is it based off of when they took the loan application, or is it going to be based off of the current rate?
No, it's based off when they close the loan. You're absolutely right. They have to qualify for that rate. Whereas, see, the permanent rate buy down, one of the advantages to the buyer is that you get a lower rate for the term of the loan, so you qualify at the lower interest rate. And sometimes we do it just for that reason, because they can qualify for more loan. And when you get the temporary rate buy down, we're going to look at the highest rate, which is the one on the third or fourth year, whatever it is, and the permanent rate, and qualify them at the higher interest rate, and they get that rate, which is set when they close the loan in the beginning.
Okay, good to know. And what's the maximum amount that you can buy down a rate? No.
That's a very insightful question, because when you buy down the rate a lot, you bump into what's called a high cost loan, and that has regulatory issues with it. And so lenders typically don't do high cost loans because of the regulatory problems. So there's a test. And usually it's somewhere between 2 and 3 something points, maybe a little higher, depending on things. It's hard for me to predict that because I don't know quite what the results are of the test. It's an automated test we run when we do the loan, and the system says, yep, you're good, or no, you're not. And if you're not, it says you could potentially have a high cost loan, and we're going to say, well, we're not going to do that. So we back off on the rate buy down and give them a higher rate with lower fees, and that solves that problem typically.
I know one question we get from buyers especially is, how do I go about getting help from the seller to buy down my rate? And people maybe not, they don't know that's our job to negotiate that for you in your offer. When you send an offer, it's within there to negotiate that. So if you do need help from the seller for that, that's where that would go in there. How do people determine whether or not, if it's a benefit financially to buy down the rate when they're getting that seller contribution, to know, like, for the long run?
Yeah, it depends a lot on personal goals, doesn't it, and their finances and all of that. So different people will choose different options depending on where they're at. I'm going to, as a matter of fact, I'll show you one. This is a real life example of a client that we closed a loan on some time back. So this is a real life example, as I mentioned, of a loan for, and we were looking at different buy downs. So what we do is we have a little Excel spreadsheet is what it comes up with that shows us the cost of the buy down. So if you look at this bottom one here, it's a 1-year buy down, and it buys the rate down. The rate, their permanent rate for this particular loan was going to be 5.625%. And they bought it down first year would have been 4.625%. The cost of that was $2,609.39. I mean, we get right down to the penny. The seller was going to pay for that, but that's not what this particular buyer wanted. They didn't even want the 2-1 buy down. They wanted the 3-2-1 buy down, and it all had to do with what they thought their income was going to do over the next 3 years. They were very comfortable with this payment because, see, in this particular case, the permanent rate again was going to be 5.625. So in year 1, if you can see that, the start rate was 2.625%. That made their principal and interest payment $2,034. Whoop, sorry about that. That's the wrong one. $1,419 a month is what their principal and interest payment was. Very, very low, right? The next year it's going to go up to 3.625. Their principal interest was going to jump to 1612. In year 3, go to 4.65. It's going to jump to 1817. And then year 4, it was going to go to 5.65, and it's not shown here, but the payment would jump one more time. So for the first 3 years, they had really, really low payments, and that's exactly what they wanted. And just for point of clarity here, this is what put this deal together. These people were not going to buy this house without getting this low payment structure. And because we were able to get the low payment structure for them, they bought the house, and it worked out really, really well.
So to qualify for the 3-2-1 style that you just mentioned, are those typically harder to qualify for? And is that why not as many people are using them? Or what is your thought there?
No, this particular loan scheme was really a great rate. This was a little while ago, 5.2. So they had to qualify at that rate, the permanent rate. That would have been the permanent rate even without the 3-2-1 buy down. So they qualified okay for the rate. They just didn't like the payment themselves. When they looked at that 30-year payment at the beginning, they were just not comfortable with that. We have a family, they had kids and all that of this many, and we just need to keep the payment down. I know my income's going to go up over the next couple of years, so I can live with it increasing. And so that's what drove this particular one, just their personal desire.
Makes sense. Are those ones a little more costly to close then?
Well, they are costly. This cost $15,000, but not to the buyer, right? The seller paid that because it's required that the seller pay that. And they did. They gave a contribution of over 15,000. I think it was $20,000 or so. So we used 15,000 of it to buy the rate down. And we used the other $5,000 of it to buy some of the closing costs down. And that lowered the cash to close for the buyer somewhat.
Okay. The 3-2-1 buy down is something that you're still offering.
Yep, 3-2-1 buy down is still being offered in this market. So is the 2-1 buy down. The rates are different than the rate we looked at there. Rates are higher right now, but yeah, you can certainly do them.
Okay. I feel like sorry, right now might be a good time for someone to potentially take advantage of that because of the payment shock that can come with today's current interest rates and giving them, a 3-year scale of, getting used to that payment. And then in the event that, say, interest rates drop significantly, say in that 2-year mark, can they refinance out of that buy down into a new one, or is there a penalty for doing any of that?
Good questions. Again, there is no penalty on any owner-occupied loan anymore, so they can refinance at any time, and that was exactly their plan. I'll be calling them. We do what's called an annual mortgage review with our clients. I'll be calling them yearly. And actually, this client says, I want you to call me like every 6 months because we talk, because he wants to really keep tabs of rates. And then when rates go down, and the anticipation is over the next year, probably, that inflation will tame a little bit and the Fed's going to start lowering rates and interest rates will come down. And then at that time, probably year 2 or 3, he's planning on doing a refinance.
Okay. So did I hear you say there's no penalty on any owner-occupied loans anymore?
Correct. No, if it's an owner-occupied loan, there is no penalty, no prepayment penalty on it. That's correct.
Got it. That's good.
Yeah. Not necessarily true for investment property loans. Fannie Mae does not have any penalties. Freddie Mac, the regular conforming conventional loans don't have prepays. But when you get into the non-QM world, which a lot of investors play in for different reasons, there are prepayment penalties potentially in that world. Only for non-owner though. Even for owner occupied in the non-QM, there are no prepayment penalties.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Well, do you have questions for us about that for our end of it?
Yeah, I do. So the negotiation strategy, which as you correctly said is on you up front, is really, really important here. So typically what happens is we chat with our real estate agent buddies like Steffani and Rozella, and we go, this client wants this, and can you negotiate that in? So how difficult have you found that to be to negotiate into the purchase at the beginning?
Not very difficult at all, honestly. I think because it's so common right now. Yeah. 2 years ago, it would have been a lot harder just because of the market change. But because of our market right now, it's not hard at all. Sellers are becoming very helpful, and they know that to get their home sold, they are having to assist buyers. One very common strategy is where your purchase price is at, you just become a little more, you add it into the purchase price just to help the seller out there. That's just one strategy that buyers are utilizing. Do you have any other strategies? I mean, just asking for it and going for it and getting it through.
I'm the type of agent that always picks up my phone and calls the other agent before I ever even write an offer.
Correct.
Structure the offer, and I ask them what's important to their sellers. And then I always ask the leading question of, if we come in at your seller's asking price, would they consider paying any seller contributions? And I just ask up front because if I know that, you know, that they've already just done a price reduction and they're already kind of squirmish about that, then more than likely they're probably gonna balk at it. So if I have to increase by, say, $5,000 over their asking price, but then I'm turning around and asking for 3%, really my client's getting about 2.5%. It's all about the communication with the agent and then of course, how you structure it.
And communicating with you, the
Mhm.
lender, and making sure that that's gonna be enough to get them into their loan comfortably.
Yep. But it's all
All
about,
really
again,
important. Agreed.
Communication is very important, though, like she said, talking with the other agent just to see if the seller is even willing, because oftentimes, like, they have a dollar amount that they need as well.
Yep.
And so it's gotta make sense to them.
Makes good
But I
sense. I agree.
but very easy to have that open conversation. Like I just structured a deal where I know my clients could have absolutely have gone higher. However, I also know that their end goal is to keep as much money in their pocket and not utilize their reserves. So even though they could potentially finance higher, doesn't mean they really want to. So therefore, I'm going to ask that leading question with a house that I know has not had any offers. They just did a recent price drop. Where can we bring them in on this? And would it be offensive to your sellers if we ask for those contributions? Because every seller has a different motivation. So it goes back to that as well.
Yep, well, but every buyer and every seller has their own motivations, so you just gotta make it fit.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Very good.
All right.
Any closing thoughts, questions, good answers?
No, but I
think
like
we
the
covered
reminder
them
of
all.
the 3-2-1 buy down, especially in today's market with that payment shock that comes into play.
I
I
agree.
think it's helpful to have other options that are there and utilize.
Yeah. We typically will talk to our clients right up front about what's important from what is important to them. And oftentimes the payment is the biggest thing. And so then we'll have the conversation, well, there's a permanent buy down possibility, and then there's a temporary buy down possibility. And they'll gravitate toward one or the other. And then depending what really works for them, we'll let Rozella, Steffani know that, and they can just incorporate it into the offer, and it comes out very good for people when it comes out.
We agree.
All right. All right, ladies. Fun chat again. Appreciate your time today. Anything else?
Thank you.
No,
I think that's it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.